Hello knitters, I'm Sonica. Thanks for joining me today for a little video about my Canyon Trail hat. The pattern is in my Ravelry and Etsy shops if you want to get your own copy and knit along with me. I try to put a lot of support into my written patterns, but sometimes it really helps to actually see in motion what is going on. The pattern is actually two versions in one. While testing this hat, one of my awesome testers brought up that it looks like you could reverse the pattern for a second row of shapes in the opposite color. I thought that was a great idea, so I added complete instructions for the second version of the pattern. If you are knitting version 1, you will have one row of the design and it will be a fitted beanie. If you are knitting version 2, you will start with one color, have 2 rows of shapes, then the colors will have switched and you will finish off with the second color. It will be a bit slouchy because fitting 2 rows of shapes takes up more room. I am going to knit version 2 for this video because it has all the same instructions for version 1 plus the extra length. Let's start with a cast on. I have a separate video for the long tail cast on my YouTube channel if you want to take a look. Really, just about any cast on will work. I like the long tail cast on because it is smooth and stretchy. After casting on, I always make sure my stitches are lined up so they don't get twisted. Twisted cast ons create this fascinating loop thing that never actually makes a hat, so I avoid them at all costs. Let's add our stitch marker and we're ready to go. When you have your ribbing done, you're going to knit one plain row in your main color. I think this sets up a nice smooth base for your design. One thing I want to mention now is you may want to add more stitch markers to your knitting. If I am new to a stitch pattern or it's complicated, I like to put a marker at the end of every repeat. For this pattern, it is every 8 stitches. Then when I finish a repeat of the instructions, I know I should be at the next marker. It keeps me on track. It's totally optional, but it can be very helpful. As you start knitting your contrast color, on this hat it's green, remember to keep it loose. My first couple of colorwork hats were unwearable because they just did not stretch enough. When you are not using the other color of yarn to knit with, it floats behind your knitting. If these floats are too tight, it's like you've tied up your knitting and it won't stretch. When I am switching colors, I stretch out the stitches I just knit like they would be if the hat was stretched on a head. Then I lay my next color over the other stitches without pulling. This adds the extra length you need to keep your hat stretchy. My patterns have handy check boxes to help you keep track of your knitting, but if you get a little lost, here's how to tell where you are. Take a look at what stitches are ahead of you. This is the last row you knit. Compare it to the chart or written directions. When you find the match, then you know you are knitting the next row after that. There is one spot in this pattern where that might not help as much. You knit 4 rows of the same pattern, 3 stitches of one color, 1 stitch of the other, and 3 then 1 again. Since there are 4 rows total of the same direction, how do you know what row you just finished? You can look at the column of contrast stitches here. It's easiest because there is just one column of the same color. Now count the V shapes. You count the V's in the knitting and the one that is sitting on the needle. So you can see here that we have one V shape here, then one on the needle. That means we have finished 2 rows of this part of the pattern and we're ready for row 13. Let's skip ahead to the decreases, which are the same for both versions. I really like to have a stitch marker for each decrease. That way, each time you get close to a stitch marker, it's time to decrease. Knit until 2 stitches before the stitch marker, then knit 2 together. For the first few decreases, we are alternating between decrease rows and plain rows. Then after a bit, we are decreasing every row, and here's why. With 8 decrease points, decreasing every round would make a very flat top without a curve to fit your head. But only doing every other row all the way up creates a point to the hat. The same angle continues and it doesn't curve to fit your head. Decreasing every other row, then every row, creates a curve that matches your head more closely than either of the other methods. How can you tell if you just finished a decrease row or a plain row? Take a look at the last stitch before the stitch marker. Plain knit fabric has 2 strands of yarn between each set of stitches, one for each stitch below. A decrease will have 3 strands of yarn between because you just put 2 stitches onto one stitch. Here you can see 3 strands of yarn in between. I have just finished a decrease row and I'm ready for a plain row. I put my knitting down a lot, so I use this strategy all the time. Now let's take a look at what you see when you have plain stitches and you're ready for a decrease row. You can see that there are 2 loops between each stitch there. So that was a plain row we just knit, and you're ready for a decrease row this time. When your hat has decreased enough that it is tight on the needles, then it's time to move on to double pointed needles. They can be hard to wrestle, but here are a few tips. Keep your needles close together when you transition from one needle to another. If you have to stretch your yarn to get from one needle to another, then you are going to have a little hole or at least a loose stitch there. It's awkward because then you have 3 needles competing for space, but it will eliminate any loose spots. You can see here, hold all 3 in one hand. It's a little awkward, but it's going to eliminate that loose spot and look a lot nicer. When you're done, leave about a 12-inch tail of yarn and weave in your ends. When you are weaving in your ends of your different colors in your 2 color section, I find it best to weave like colors with like colors. That way, if the yarn you're weaving in gets a little too close to the front surface of your hat, it won't be noticeable. It will blend in with the color it's woven into. There it is. I love this hat and I hope you love yours too. The only thing left to do is block your hat. If you haven't blocked your knits before, do it. You will be surprised at how much better your stitches look after a good blocking. Check out my How to Block a Hat video for thorough instructions. Thank you so much, knitters, for joining me. I hope you picked up some tips and tricks to make your knitting easier, less frustrating, and more enjoyable. You can see other Canyon Trail hats people have knit on Instagram by checking out the hashtag Canyon Trail Hat or hashtag Sonica Knits. Happy knitting!